The first speaker will be Judith Browne Dianis from the Advancement Project. And for those of you who don't know, let me say a few words about the Advancement Project and the work that Judith has done there. It is a civil rights organization, and it deals not only with questions of zero tolerance discipline and developing alternatives, but it has a broad civil rights agenda. It's working on issues of voter suppression and other issues of civil rights. And the reason why I know all of this is that Judith and I have a very good friend in common, Jerry Hudson, and we both had an opportunity to see him, which is a very rare thing, because he had to bring the two of us together so we could get her here today. So without any further ado, let me turn the lectern over to Judith.
So good afternoon. So first, I first wanted to thank you, Leo, and to thank Randy for her leadership on what is a difficult issue in our schools. Just by way of introduction, so Advancement Project is a multiracial civil rights organization. We opened our doors 15 years ago. And the first work that we did actually was around school discipline in the Mississippi Delta. And we were working with a community that found that they felt that the schools were inadequate, but in fact that students couldn't stay in the classroom long enough to get the inadequate education because they were being suspended so often. And what they found was that young people were being suspended for things like talking back to a teacher for 10 days. The Mississippi still has corporal punishment. So they were also getting paddled, and it was a place where, in fact, when the child would get paddled, the teacher would actually carve a notch in the paddle for each child that they whooped. And they actually carved holes in the paddles so that when it hit, it would suck the skin out to hurt you a little bit more. But what was important was that in about that same time, in 1999, Reverend Jesse Jackson called us because he was involved in a situation in Decatur, Illinois, where about 5 young African-American males were engaged in a fight at a football game, and it was caught on videotape and it was televised around the country. And they were saying melee at the football game, and in fact what it was a very short, brief fight, but when you're in the stands it looks like a melee because everybody's running and moving, and et cetera. And so the young men were actually were recommended for 2-year expulsions. And they were seniors and juniors, and so we knew that that meant that they were not going to come back to school, that they would drop out. And so he called us to ask us, well, what's the civil rights hook? And that was like the first time that I had heard the term zero tolerance, and so I started doing a lot of research on what is this thing called zero tolerance, and actually, went and figured out that actually it is part of it is terminology used from the war on drugs, that it was used, that when we brought it into schools in the 1980s, it was around the time when psychologists had labeled young people predators. And so we decided to crack down on young people in our schools with zero tolerance. And then we started to use all of these kinds of mechanisms that we were taking from the war on drugs and from the criminal justice system, such as 3 strikes and you're out. So you get 3 warnings and you're suspended from school. And we, started seeing the broken windows theory, which is used in New York City and in other places, where you do something small and we crack down on that so that you don't become a bigger perpetrator of a crime in school. And so all of this kind of giving us actually very similar outcomes to what we have seen on the war on drugs, a disproportionate impact on African Americans and particularly African American boys and young men. And so I started doing research on this and met with principals. And one of the things I wanted to, that I learned early on was that a lot of what was happening in schools was really around leadership. And that, in fact, in some schools that were high-achieving schools, and what I did was I talked to principals in different schools in Miami. And what I found was that the schools that were high-achieving, even if they had similar demographics to a low-achieving school, where they had, a majority black school, or et cetera, if the principal decided, you know what, we're not suspending children because the best place for them to be is here in school. And in fact, we're scared of what might happen to them when they go out on the street. And in fact, what we're about is we're engaging students. We're keeping them involved. We're challenging them. We're actually giving them all the kinds of things that just excite them about being in school, so we don't suspend. And so that principal, her suspension rates were low and academic achievement high. Went to another school across town. Principal said, I raised 3 sons on my own. I believe in zero tolerance. You have to crack down. I have 3 boys, and I know you have to be harsh on them. And in fact, high suspension rates and, as you would imagine, low academic performance, because we know that if you are out of class, you're not learning. If you're not learning, you can't get a good test score. If you can't get a good test score, then your school nowadays is labeled as failing. And not only is your school labeled as failing, but your teachers and your principals are labeled as failing. And if your teachers and your principals are labeled as failing and the kids are failing, then we're going to close down the school. And then we're going to turn it over to a charter, and we're going to give them the building. And when we give them the building, they'll come in and they'll take it over. And guess what? They're not going to get any better results. But guess what? It's a nonprofit, and our friends are paying these people for that. And everybody gets, the privatization movement gets going, and we see more of that. And so that's what we're seeing across the country, is that we are in a discipline crisis. And discipline actually is very connected to academic outcome. And so we're also in a time when we've realized that we have to turn the tide. So a few things that I wanted to put out there is, one is suspensions don't work. I have lots of cites to things. It's very funny because for a long time, those of us who were activists around this issue said these things and we didn't have cites. And then there's this research collaborative that now gives us citations to all the things that we knew. Suspensions don't work. They don't change behaviors. We now know that if a child is suspended one time in 9th grade, they're 2 times more likely to drop out of school. We know that there's no correlation between high achievement and high suspensions. You just can't find a school that has high suspensions and great academic outcomes. The larger the school, the higher the rate of suspension for black males. When you control for class, because people say, oh, it's poor kids. No, actually, when you control for class, race still matters in the discipline equation. So, race is very important in this conversation. Actually, the Children's Defense Fund started documenting this issue in the 1970s, that black children were being disproportionately suspended. We know that from the work that we do at Advancement Project, that one of the things that we have focused on, because we don't focus on just the problem, we focus on changing. And we've been working with grassroots groups throughout the country to make a difference on discipline issues and to reform discipline from the ground up. And what we have found is that one of the things that we focus on is doing away with the subjective things. Because if I'm in a classroom and you're in a classroom, what's insubordinate to me may not be insubordinate to you. What's disruptive to me might not be disruptive to you. What's disrespectful to you may not be disrespectful to me. And so we don't have these kinds of standards for what actually are these subjective things. Drugs, either you had them or you didn't. A gun, had it or didn't. Knife, had it or didn't. And so when we have these subjective offenses in our codes of conduct, it allows not only for the discretion, but it allows for bias to enter into the equation. And I know that you're going to have a presentation about this, but I just want to say, we all have biases of one sort or another. Now, it's one thing to have a bias, it's another to act upon the bias. And so when we look at, when I always cringe when I know that the Department of Ed is putting out some stats, right? Because the stats are good, but the stats sometimes give us the impression when we look at suspension rates that daggone, Black and Latino kids are just bad because their suspension rates are higher, their arrest rates are higher. But we have to dig a little deeper. You can't it's like looking at just test scores, right? Say, the school's good, the school's bad, we know we don't want to do that, right? That's why the reformers are all wrong. They're just wrong. So when we look down in that data and we see what the suspensions are for, and we see what the arrests are for, a majority of them are for the subjective things. In the state of Florida, 2/3 of the arrests in schools are for misdemeanors. When you look at the misdemeanors, most of them are for disorderly conduct. Now, what's disorderly conduct? I happen to be in I went to a juvenile court in Florida when I was doing some research. Just wanted to sit in and see what's happening, and I see all these Black kids in their orange jumpsuits. Several of them have been arrested in school. One of them was charged with assault on school personnel. Well, what had happened was this young man was walking down the hall with his baseball cap on. I bet everybody can relate to this example, right? He has on his baseball cap, but he's walking down the hall, and the principal says to him, "Take your hat off." And the young man actually was walking down the hall, and very important, walking down the hall with his girlfriend. Important. Respect, 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 respect. It's screaming out for respect. So he's walking down the hall, and he says, "I have permission to wear this." Because, in fact, he had had some kind of skin thing on his head, and he had gotten permission from the assistant principal, but the assistant principal wasn't around. And the principal says, "Take it off." I said, "Take it off." The young man refuses to take it off. So the next thing you know, the principal calls the police in. The police come into the situation. This is in Palm Beach County, Florida, in the Glades. You ever been to the Glades? Have you been to the Glades? It's a different world on that side of Palm Beach County. It's not like the Palm Beach that most of us know about. So he goes and calls the police officer in. They get the young man up against the wall. Police on both sides of him for the baseball cap. Don't forget what we're talking about. He's against the wall. The principal reaches in, the young man pushes back. He's embarrassed by what is going on his scalp. He has informed the principal, "I have permission because I have an infection." Pulls it off, pushes back against the principal, assaults against school personnel, which in Florida is actually a felony charge. So, these are the kinds of things that we see. Disorderly conduct. A young girl, 9 years old in Palm Beach County, actually goes into a classroom where it's a cooking classroom. She takes the flour out and throws it around, messes up the room, and they arrested her, 9, for breaking and entering because she didn't have permission to be in the classroom, and criminal mischief because she messed up the room. Now, in most instances, we probably would have said, "Clean up the damn room," right? We would have talked to the parent. We would have figured out something else for her to do so that she takes responsibility for what she did and that she learns from it. But when you put handcuffs on a 9-year-old child, you have to imagine that the impact of that for a lifetime. I've never had handcuffs. I don't know. But I would imagine that it leaves not only scars on wrists, but scars on your mind. So what do we do differently? So it's hard, right? It's hard because teachers are under a lot of pressure to get test scores up. Now I got Common Core. Now in my daughter's school district, we go to Prince George's County. All the teachers are like, "This Common Core thing, we just learned about this in July. School started in August. We don't know what the hell it is." And my principal says we're in transition. And so I know that there are a lot of pressures that are about, like, how do I get this kid out? Because the kid is, I need to keep moving, right? I have a pacing guide, I have a, et cetera. I got to get this kid out. But at the end of the day, you get Johnny out today, he comes back, and he's going to be more disruptive tomorrow. Because now he's fallen behind, he can't catch up, and he's thinking, he's just can't figure out what's going on, so he starts talking to his neighbor, and he becomes more disruptive. So what we do about changing. So we've worked in school districts, and I think I wanted to just impart with you that you can do this. Si se puede. And that is, we have done work in Denver, Broward County, the state of Florida, Baltimore, Buffalo, where we have seen some real changes. So I just wanted to give you a few pieces about those places. So in Denver, Colorado, we worked with a group called Padres and Jóvenes Unidos, where young people, Latino students, were being treated harshly. At one point, there was one principal who decided that all Latino children, if they were going to be punished during lunchtime, only Latino children would have to sit on the floor and eat their lunch. The parents decided that that seemed too much like they were being treated like less than human and wanted to push back. And so in an 8-year campaign, which was an old school organizing campaign, it took us 8 years to get to a change in the school discipline code. And again, important because of the leader. There was a Superintendent Bennett at the time, who's now a senator, who decided that we can't keep on this path. And so what we have seen since the change, and we actually went back in 2 years, we're able to limit the role of police. We did a report called Derailed, the Schoolhouse to Jailhouse Track, which was one of the first reports written about school-based arrests, and really opened up our eyes in this country to how many young people were being arrested in school, not just suspended. So in Denver, where we were able to limit the role of police, because police were actually doing the discipline job too, right? They were like arresting for just whatever is discipline, the disorderly. Disrespect becomes disorderly on the criminal side, and we know that police in schools, police typically, a lot of them are not trained to be in the schools, they're trained to be on the street. They're not trained in child development, so they don't know to de-escalate. They don't know that kids are pushing the limits, right? And so they get their backs up, and masculinity comes into it, and so does the young person's. And so we worked with them to limit the role of police, and we've seen suspensions come down by 60% there. Since 2003, we've seen the dropout rates come down by 40%. We've seen the number of graduates go up by 30%. Really important because it also required really looking at how the culture of the schools and putting restorative justice practices in place. They did some pilots on restorative justice. We also, in that code of conduct, it's, I think, probably one of the only codes of conduct in the country that actually has written into it that the school district has to address and the schools have to address racial disparities. And what's interesting is in Denver, while we've seen those numbers, we still see, and the numbers have come down across the board for all races, but we still see racial disparities. So we're going to go back and do work around racial bias there. In Buffalo had 41 students suspended every day. And 1 in 5 students suspended in the district versus 1 in 20 in the state. A 50% graduation rate, black students 56% of enrollment, but 72% of suspensions. In 2010, there was a young man named Juwan Daniels. Juwan was roaming the halls during school one day, and the school somebody recommended him for suspension. The school decided to suspend him. He did not wait for his mother to come pick him up. He was 17 years old. They put him out on the street. Juwan was killed in a drive-by. The administration in Buffalo Public Schools would tell you that that was a change moment for them, that they would not want to wish that on any school district. That they actually should not have suspended that young man because now they know that being suspended actually has some extra harmful effects that they had not thought about. So they went through a process. We have our community partners there with Citizen Action New York and Alliance for Quality Ed, and we have changed the school code of conduct there to focus on prevention and intervention. Referrals to support staff and alternatives to suspension, such as conflict resolution and restorative justice. Restorative justice is used for things like minor fighting instead of getting the suspension, because part of what we know that we have to do is that we have to get at root causes. You know, I have a niece who was just, I shouldn't laugh, it's not funny. She's 11 years old and she's in public school. She actually got slapped by another girl. And what led to it was that they were they were at lunch, and one girl was standing over her, and she said, you know, get away from me. And finally, an adult intervened and said, you know, you need to move away. And the little girl would not move away from my niece, so then the adult called a police officer into the situation. The police officer, then the girl walked away, and then they get into the hall, and the girl then slapped my niece. So my sister says to me, you know, this kid, you know, suspension is required. I'm like, no, let me tell you what should have happened. Let's rewind the tape. When the child was standing over your daughter, that was the moment where the adult should have intervened to have a conversation, to understand what is going on between the two of you, right? Okay. Even if we got past that situation and we got her moved away, the next thing that should have happened is the two of them should have sat down in a room with an adult who is trained in mediation to understand what's going on, because that girl now has been suspended and is coming back, and she's still not happy. Next, she slapped her once, she might kick you know what the next time, okay? I've seen it happen in my daughter's school. The adult comes in and says, get away from each other, instead of getting at the root cause. I said to an adult one day at a basketball game, you didn't address the problem. You told them to walk away. That girl is staring at this other girl across the court. They're gonna fight. And she said, that's all right, they can fight, they'll get suspended. I said, and then what? So I think that we have to change culture. So in Buffalo, we've done that. In Broward, what happened was as Randy said, hate to use it, but stakeholders, several people, including the teachers union, school administrators, the NAACP Advancement Project got around the table, and we talked about the change that needed to happen in Broward. Their Superintendent Runcie, it's the 6th largest school district in the country. He said, we're not doing this any longer. As a result, we have changed the code of conduct. In 1 year's time, their suspensions have come down by 66%. Their school-based arrests are down by 41%. Dewana, who's here with me, knows that yesterday I was on a radio show and in Chicago, and Superintendent Runcie did a call-in to the radio show in Chicago from Broward because he has drank the Kool-Aid. He knows that, in fact, what they're doing is transformational, and that they are going to put young people on the path to success, and that the suspensions and arrests that they were doing before is not working. And so I think I just want to leave you all with the fact that it can be done. It is hard work. It is about shifting cultures. It is about doing something out of the box. It is about understanding children, understanding culture, dealing with our biases, but it can be done. Thank you.
So we're going to take questions for Judith first, because she needs to go on to another engagement. So I owe somebody a question if you want to start.
Hi, I'm Jillian Arns from Cleveland, and my question, I think it really does pertain to what you were just talking about. We've been working collaboratively between the district and the union for the last several years to implement SEL programs and to help meet our student needs. We find when we're trying to engage teachers and staff in the high school level, we're getting a little more resistance, and I wondered if you had any tips or ways, because a lot of times we hear, I teach math I teach science.
Okay.
So how could we help engage staff members at the high school level to understand the value of the work?
Well, so I think, so one of the things that I think was, we did in Baltimore, was a real process of bringing people along. Because not everybody believes this stuff, right? And so what we did was that we actually brought in a lot of speakers so that people can understand the research. If you need to know the research, let's know the research. Let's hear from young people. That's the other thing. Do we do school surveys? You know, this, I always say that, you know, education is one of those fields where, you know, we don't listen to the consumer too often. And so the consumer should be asked, how is this working for you? How would you like to see it work differently, right? An assessment of relationships between teachers and students is sometimes a wake-up call for people when they know that actually, because teachers are in this for the right reasons, right? But if their relationships are being broken because they're in fact, you know, treating kids poorly, or not treating them with the nurturing, loving kind of, you know, thing that most kids need, even until they graduate, right? Then I think it starts to turn on some light bulbs. So I think part of it is that we have to bring people along with a process that gives them the information, the research, the data, the surveys, to get everybody in the psyche. And then to open up, so we say restorative justice, and people are like, restorative justice, but what does that mean, right? And in a practical sense, right? Because the other thing is that you want all teachers to be trained in restorative justice. You don't want one person in the school. You don't want one person doing conflict resolution, because there's a long list of people who have to go to conflict resolution. In DC, I remember years ago, there was a conflict resolution program where there was a long line to sign up for it, and what happened was a young man, because they couldn't get them into the program quick enough, there was a school shooting, and a kid got killed because they couldn't get them to mediation. So we have to show people like what that looks like, because just to say the words doesn't mean anything, but that they can do it.
Thank you.
Yes.
Matt Haney, I'm a school board member in San Francisco Unified. I love that you brought up the hat issue. That's something that we were actually talking about this morning and has been kind of a pet peeve of mine. I'm actually introducing a resolution, I can't be there, on changing our hat policies, because it's these small rules that end up becoming bigger issues.
Right.
And what I'm wondering is, on something like that, how do you balance the need to change rules that clearly are creating these kind of conditions with changing culture and allowing schools to kind of work out their own issues? So when you look at these issues from a school district perspective, would you encourage the school district, whether the school board or whoever, to actually change the rules themselves and say, we're not going to do some of these things anymore? Or would you try to create processes which allow school communities to come to that conclusion themselves?
So I think it has to happen at a school board level, but I think that the schools have to be involved in the process, right? Because what will happen is you will get backlash. People will be like, you know, hell no, we're not doing this. If they're not involved, even if at the board level, if you're going to do a policy, there has to be a collaborative, you know, process to get people involved, to understand why we should do it, to understand how we can do it, why it's not going to be disruptive to them, why they're still going to be able to get their job done. And that process has to happen. But then each building has to have a culture discussion, right? And that's got to include parents, that's got to include young people, a lot of young people, not just the kids who are the student government people, right? No. You know, and I think like having those discussions, like what are the norms? It's just like being in an office, like you set norms and values within the school, right? But you don't just set it like just the principal. These are going to be the norms. These are going to be, you know, but everyone kind of buying into it. I've seen places where even when the school discipline code comes out, and what Padres does is that their young people actually go do the beginning of the year assembly on discipline and on students' rights. So it's not just a discipline discussion, but it's about how we act as a community. And what our rights are also, because kids always feel like you're just talking discipline. It's all about punishment, right? Because discipline's actually supposed to be teaching, but it's become punishment. And so having young people being able to be involved in that process and be in the school building in that process so that they are part of it. And then everyone like falls in the norms because they've bought into it, and they've not only bought into it, but they designed it collectively.
Yes, Marietta.
Yeah, Marietta English.
Could you use the mic so that they can pick up?
Step out of my shoe.
You go barefoot, that's fine.
Marietta English, Baltimore Teachers Union. Which schools did you work with in Baltimore? Are you still working with them? And how long did it take you
Yep.
to turn those schools around?
So we actually worked with at the school district level when Andres was there. So we rewrote the school discipline code, and so what we did was we worked, and it was a collaborative process with, he brought in many of the administrators to go through kind of like we did like months of presentations of researchers and what could work, et cetera. So it wasn't, that particular instance was not at the school building level, but it was more at the district level.
So it was you who sent that message, no suspensions. I mean, only
right.
because I got
So,
that.
and
we
here's the
can't
thing.
suspend kids anymore. We can't suspend
Okay,
kids
so
anymore,
here's the thing, and I just want to dispel this real quick. When school districts do reform, they're not saying no suspensions. They're really not. I mean, so I would challenge you to say, I mean, I have not seen a school district that now has a school
I
code
don't-
of conduct
Right.
that says, this is important.
Right.
Okay?
It was.
Because this is important to get at this nuance, okay? What we're saying is, take a different approach. Look at the alternatives. We're not saying no suspensions. We're saying there's something else we could be doing. And the reason I'm saying that is just because I've heard that phrase every time we go in to do reform someplace. People say, oh, now we don't have any suspensions. No, that's not true. What we're saying is that suspensions don't work. Why are you using something that doesn't work, right? Now, if you use suspensions for something that is a violent act, if it really does infringe upon the safety of a school environment, makes sense, right? But if we're using it for those subjective things and the things for which hasn't changed behavior, usually we see a lot of recidivism around suspensions because you haven't changed the behavior. So this really isn't about no suspensions. This is about using tools that work.
Right. It's just that when it filters down to the masses, it was no suspensions.
Right.
They never heard the other part. All they heard was no suspensions.
Well, but because
So, it was
that actually is the backlash narrative.
Right.
That's
So-
not out of the school district. That's out of the backlash narrative that wants to, oh, now they're telling us no suspensions. That's where that's from. So we have to be correct in our language so that we understand that, in fact, we're just asking for us to get back to teaching, and unfortunately, a lot of places, we got to put common sense back in discipline because, these preschool numbers that have come out, the arrests of preschoolers, we don't have a whole lot of evidence that that's going to do any good for those children.
I agree. It's just that it's great information, but when it comes out that way to the masses, then they become turned off from it, and then they don't see the bigger
Right.
picture.
So, and I will.
So
I,
how
yep.
do we then
Yep.
turn it around?
So this is why I'm saying that that school districts, if you're going to engage in reform, it has to be a bigger process than a superintendent and his school safety person sitting at the table, right?
Right.
Because it has to be that, and in that process, you have to have a team of people who are going to be the proselytizers, who are going to go out to schools and explain, this is why we've made this change, this is what the change means, and give real information about what we're going to do also to provide resources so that if we're taking suspensions away, this is what you can do. So I agree that
So
in
that's
every district, it has to be that there is beyond just a little table of people that sit down and change it.
And see, that's the piece that didn't happen. All we had was the code of conduct come out, and then first thing they heard was no suspensions. That's all they saw, not the explanation. So I think when you do this, there's got to be more involved and more as they said, more training for teachers so they really understand the message here, because they just did not understand it. That's why I wanted to know what school was it, because
Right.
I know what I got back
Right.
to me. Yeah, thank you.
Back in the third row.
Right.
Hi, I'm Susan Solomon from San Francisco, Executive Vice President of United Educators of San Francisco. So you answered part of my question when you answered Marietta. I do want to say, we see some of the same thing. Principals begin to feel like they cannot suspend students, but there's nothing else put in place. So when you were citing some statistics, you were able to link a drop in suspensions to an increase in graduation rates and a decrease in, and an increase in.
School-based arrests.
Yes, school-based arrests, thank you. So what was happening in addition to cutting down on suspensions?
So, so in that district in Denver, they actually, they put restorative justice programs in place. So, you know, I mean, at the end of the day, we, you know, the work around, you can't just change the code of conduct. Like, you just can't just do that, right? You have to be able to provide the resources that are needed for restorative justice programs. And I'm one who actually thinks that restorative justice programs and conflict resolution, some of this stuff does not cost a whole lot of money. And it's about priorities in the budgets, right? And so in San Francisco, when you're thinking about changes, you know, think about how much are we spending on police and surveillance cameras, you know, instead of counselors and restorative justice training, right? And a restorative justice coordinator. So I think that, you know, that has to be done, and that was done in Denver. It's also been done in Buffalo, and you know, and they have PBIS also, and you know, so like PBIS is, you know, it's one thing, but people add on these other programs in addition to them.
There was someone up here, no? Yes, here, and then and back, and that'll be it for this round.
Thank you. Rebecca Gagnon, Minneapolis Public School Board. Has there been any studies linking class size to numbers of suspensions, to more discipline? Because the larger, if you have 35 kids in a fourth grade class with a lot of high needs students, and you have one teacher,
Right.
and you have to at some point teach all the kids.
So
And
I
so
don't know if class size, but I do know that there have been studies just linking like whether or not someone's had classroom management training to discipline. And, you know, if you haven't had it, then you're more likely to have higher suspension rates.
Right. So you don't think there's any correlation between too
So
many kids in a class?
So the answer
Oh,
is
you just don't know.
the answer is I do not know.
Yes.
Hi, David Beard, Advocates for Children and Youth in Maryland. And we do a lot of work on this issue, and I just wanted to...
Hey, David.
Hi, I see Dianis over there. Some of our partners. So I also want to address what Marietta, the concern that she had, which is very real in Baltimore, which was, and it goes back to something that Randy was saying about just changing a policy and not dealing with implementation, which I think was sort of the piece that maybe wasn't done as fully as it could have been. And I think now the city, and with Karen and Weber at BCPS, that's doing quite a bit of work on implementation, on things like doing climate walks, building positive school climates, getting those alternatives to suspension, whether it be sort of all the things that Pedro was talking about, the detention, the SWAT program they have in Montgomery County, which is where you actually work on a Saturday morning in lieu of a suspension. All these different types of alternatives that are out there. There's a whole base of work and research that we've been working on at our organization, acy.org. We're state-based, but we have lots of information about how to do this implementation piece well. So please come talk to us. We're trying to work with schools, working with Baltimore City, and I know there are other groups out there doing this. I'm saying all this, and that I absolutely agree, and I've been pushing advocates in the State Department to really focus on what can we do. I feel like you have teachers in here and school board members that really want to do the right thing. They just need the help to do that. So I think that's some of the next piece of work in these locations where they have the impetus to change the policy. Now they just need to know, okay, so now what do we do? And I think that you can work with your local stakeholders to do that.
So I just wanted to give our website where we have resources. It's www.safequalityschools.org. And we have resources for school districts, for teachers. We keep coming up with new ones, so keep checking in.
Thank you. Can you hold that to the next round?
Actually, all it is information on the class size thing, and I can do it later.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead, David,
Oh, no,
please.
Okay, all right. All right, so quickly. I do think there may be some research, but let me give you results of two experimental studies. On the one hand, what we know from the STAR study that was done in Tennessee is particularly for kids who are at risk and kids of color, class size in the early grades has long-term implications as well as short-term implications, and it really worked. When we did with RAND a study of class size reduction in California, where the governor wanted to do it immediately, and you did not bring in quality teachers, it didn't really have a difference. But all of you who are teachers, and I know myself as a former college university teacher, know that when you're balancing more people, it really is likely to affect what you're doing. And so that there's a logical reason as well. I'll also try to find the research, because I bet it is, and I'll share it with Judy as well.
Thank you.
And thank you for your presentation, Judy.
Thank you.
So I'd like to thank Judith for her presentation.